The train left the depot close to midnight. The departure log included the number, route, time, names of 2 drivers, and a mechanic's note about the inspection. The platform smelled of iron and damp dust. The lamps hung low, illuminating the switches and the dark sides of the cars. The creaking of couplings, short commands, and clanking of metal, a familiar nighttime rhythm where everything sounds smooth and uninterrupted. The locomotive was in good working order. Matte paint, peeling edges, traces of recent repairs at the joints of the casings. The cab smelled of rubber and warm coffee from a thermos. A bunch of keys lay on the shelf, a notebook nearby, and route sheets folded in half. The radio had been checked, and the signal was clear. The brakes had been checked twice, by the signalman at the train and by the drivers themselves before entering the main line. The senior engineer loved night shifts. He said the track was cleaner at night because there was less extraneous noise. His assistant, younger, kept a notebook with notes, checkpoint times, temperature readings on the slopes, brief notes on the weather. Both were known for their neatness. No talking, no deviations. Their photographs hung in a row in the staff room with dozens of others, unremarkable except that they always arrived early. They spoke little before setting off. The senior officer checked the pressure gauges, touching the glass with the back of his hand, an old gesture not written into any regulations. The assistant opened the route sheets and compared the marks with the duty officer. The times were correct, the schedule was smooth, the elevation change was moderate. The night was dry, a light northerly wind blew, the temperature was below freezing. The station's signal line shimmered with green and yellow lights, like a slow metronome. The cargo manifest looked standard: building materials, industrial packaging, several containers for inventory items. Numbers, weights, senders and recipients, seal notes, everything was filled out neatly. One container had a note stating, "Special storage conditions." A short note without explanation. Such lines are common and usually indicate temperature control or fragility. The storekeeper checked the seals, recorded the numbers in the log, and found no foreign traces. The coupling took about 20 minutes. The commands were short and clear. Pull, stop, close. Individually, the cars were cargo. Together, they became a line that would travel through the night. The night air was dry and cold, cutting into the lungs. The signalman smoked, shielding his hand from the wind, the red dot glowing in the darkness. A shunting diesel hummed on the distant siding, rolling past dark platforms. The signal to leave was given on schedule. The wheels hummed dully, the cab shuddered, and the pointer outside the window retreated. A short call came over the radio. "First one, go." The reply was flat. "Route clear. Sister's station has been notified." The duty officer's voice was calm, carrying the familiar emptiness of the night, when every word seems farther away than during the day. The officer in charge placed his hand on the handle, pulled the traction rod, and the locomotive entered the main line. The checkpoints proceeded according to schedule, neat numbers appearing in the assistant's notebook. The railway stores its memory in numbers, stamps, and repeated words. Passed, left, braked. At one section, they made a brief technical stop. They checked the coupling and let the brake shoes cool. The metallic smell intensified for a second and then subsided, as it does after cooling. Everything was within the schedule and required no comment. The night was clear. The cab window revealed a dark corridor of rails. To the left, the occasional lights of a farm. To the right, low warehouse buildings. Then the line stretched into nothingness. The noise became a background noise, steady and wordless. On the descent, the assistant noted the temperature of the brake shoes. On the ascent, the senior driver backed off the traction to avoid overloading the coupling. Short bridges and 2 traffic lights followed each other with a familiar rhythm. Empty platforms occasionally loomed dark on the side tracks, like switched-off screens. Communication was smooth. Each control point was a short dialogue. At one point, the signal became fainter. A background noise appeared, low, almost inaudible. The supervisor asked to repeat, and the duty officer replied without alarm. Reception normal. The signal returned clear. Sometimes the radio picks up echoes of empty lines reflected off the rails. Engineers know this. The assistant noted it with a single word: background. Without explanation, without guesswork, The last recorded radio contact occurred between two sparsely populated stations. "Approaching the control tower," said the leader. "The control tower is ready," they replied. Then, as per regulations, there was silence until the next call. Silence in work is a marked time. It is respected so as not to drown out the necessary words. The cabin moved into darkness, where the sounds become denser but do not change. The track led into deeper darkness, where the earth swirled around the line, never parting. According to the schedule, there was a slight curve ahead, a small bridge, then a straight line along the warehouse district, and the final station beyond a short siding. The senior trainman knew this section by the smallest signs: the noise of the bridge ribs, the way the wheels handled the curve, the shadows of the stones along the embankment. He kept the traction steady, neither adding nor removing anything unnecessary. A dim light burned in the cabin, casting a soft glow on the dashboard. A thermos sat on the shelf, still warm from the evening's boiling water. A folded raincoat with a frayed collar lay on the left seat, a cloak they'd carried for years in case of cold weather. These things don't require words, they simply exist, part of the everyday life of the railway. Beyond the glass, the station lights became sparse, like fireflies, and faded behind them. The duty officer at the final station waited as scheduled. An open journal lay on the desk, a pen nearby, and a white-faced clock on the wall. The room smelled of paper and the sticky tape on change tins. He listened to the steady background music he'd grown accustomed to through his headphones. The approach time passed, and the duty officer raised his head, but heard nothing. He wasn't immediately surprised. Delays happen, technical stops, maneuvers, coupling checks. He waited 5 minutes and contacted the intermediate control. A curt reply came. Passed. After that, silence returned. The railroad thrives not on events, but on habits. The mechanic arrives early, the storekeeper checks the seals, the duty officer checks the points, the drivers keep their hands on the handle. In this system, every detail carries weight, but it doesn't make history. A thermos on the shelf is a trifle. A raincoat on the seat is a trifle. They merely confirm that the night is proceeding as usual, demanding no attention. In such silence, only the sound of iron can be heard, and that signifies order. There are points along the line where time becomes visible. Traffic lights, bridges, checkpoints. At night, they resemble islands from which the water of the track can be seen. That night, the sequence ran smoothly. It was precisely this smoothness that would later become strange. There was no sign of a break, not a sound, not a trace, not a word. A cabin smelling of rubber and coffee, a notebook with neat lines, a radio contact recorded in a log, and then a gap in which nothing was said. In the warehouse area, some of the lighting was out, making the darkness denser. The wind there was colder than in the fields, wafting dampness and dust. The engineers knew this, but didn't comment. Everything was written down in the schedule. Everything was factored into the traction. As they approached the bridge, the assistant listened to the noise of the wheels. It was a steady hum. He wrote down one word in his notebook, bridge, and covered the page with his hand to keep the pen from smearing the ink. The bridge was behind them, and ahead lay the straight stretch to the station. The time for approaching the final destination had passed again. The duty officer placed his palm on the table, as if marking a pause, and picked up the receiver. His voice was calm as always. He spoke the required phrase and waited for a smooth response. No alarm, only the absence of the word arrived. The log remained open, the line empty, as if the night had decided to extend itself for another page. This chapter records only what happened. People, things, documents, numbers, silence. The night of 1993 began smoothly and was supposed to end just as smoothly. The train departed, passed the checkpoints, crossed the bridge, and headed straight ahead. What followed was emptiness, which would only become a fact in the morning, when the line arrived never appeared in the log. For now, it is merely the absence of a word, a small square of unfilled time. At the end of his shift, the duty officer lowered his pen, waited another 10 minutes, and then rang the bell. He had no idea that this pause would become the first line of the train that didn't reach the station file. At that moment, it was simply a missing marker. The railroad didn't stop. It never stops for a single train, but the station's memory learns to hold on to such pauses. pauses. It's its job to maintain silence until someone says another word. Found. The morning at the station began with the familiar smell of paper and cold metal. The duty officer opened the logbook, ran his finger down the lines, and stopped at an empty space. The train, scheduled to arrive by dawn, hadn't checked in. At first, this didn't cause alarm. Delays were common, especially at night, but after half an hour of waiting, the empty space became a fact. Phone calls went up and down the line, first to the intermediate control station, where they confirmed the train had passed, then to neighboring stations where there was no answer. Radio contact remained clear but silent. The duty officer made the first entry. Delay. Reason unknown. That line marked the beginning of the investigation. By midday, linemen were out on the line. They crossed the bridge, checked the switches, and inspected the embankment. The tire tracks were smooth, with no signs of derailment. In one section, they noticed dark skid marks extending to the side, but further on, they stopped. Remnants of cargo lay along the embankment. Pieces of packing cloth, a metal bracket, a wooden crate with a broken lid. They collected all of this and recorded it in the report. The train itself was missing. That evening, the first official report was drawn up. It read, "Train no, did not arrive. Skid marks and cargo debris were found on the track. The locomotive and cars are missing." The station attendant, the trackman, and the depot representative signed the report. The document was as formal as it should be. No unnecessary words, just the facts. The newspapers reacted quickly. A short note appeared in the local column. The overnight freight train did not reach the station. Search is underway. The cause is being investigated. By evening, the city was already talking about the derailment. Some claimed the train had derailed and burned. Others that it had been hijacked. Rumors multiplied faster than the reports. The next day, the search was expanded. Crews marched along the line, checking bridges, ravines, and warehouse areas. No traces were found, only the void where the train should have been. The reports read, "Inspected, not found." These words were repeated dozens of times, becoming the rhythm of the paper. A week later, the official version emerged. An accident. The train allegedly derailed in a remote area and burned. The drivers' bodies were never found, but the documents now stated, "died in the line of duty." For the railway, this meant the closure of the case. For the families, it was the beginning of a never-ending wait. In the staff room, the photos of the train drivers were removed from the wall and placed in a separate folder. Their names remained on the lists, but a note appeared next to them. Lost. A new file was opened in the station archives, the first line of which read, "Disappearance of a train, 1993. The railway continued to operate. Trains came and went, points clicked, lamps glowed, but there remained a gap on the line that could not be filled. Every duty officer, opening the log, saw an empty box in the column for that morning. It remained a reminder that a train could vanish, leaving behind nothing but scraps of cargo and a short newspaper article. So the disappearance became a fact, not an event, not a catastrophe, but a fact, recorded in protocols and silence. And this silence was louder than any explanations. The years following the disappearance began not with grand meetings, but with routine work. The line was inspected according to schedule. Linemen walked the embankments, looking for cracks in the beams, loose fasteners, and loose gravel. Their routes were marked on paper with dotted lines, and each line was repeated season after season. The reports featured familiar words: inspected, replaced, fixed. The missing train had no effect on these lines. It remained in another folder, where time was filed away in neat, identical sheets. The drivers' families frequented the station's archives and reading room. The room, lit by long lamps, was quiet, only the creaking of chairs and the rustling of paper. Files, schedules, reports, inspection reports strewn across the tables. Occasionally, pencil marks appeared in the margins, numbers, arrows, the occasional underline. In the file, "Missing Train," 1993. The pages were neat and terse. Not found. Skid marks. Fragments of cargo. Official version. Accident. These words repeated like railroad traffic lights. One color followed another, and no unexpected signal appeared. Newspapers quickly stopped reporting on the case. Only short annual reports remained, with the line "Case Closed" flashing alongside road incidents and repairs. In town conversations, the disappearance faded into the background, behind which lay work, shifts, and schedules. Occasionally, someone at a kiosk bench would mention "that train," but their voice was vague, as if discussing the weather. Memory favors generalities when facts are lacking. Life at the station revolved around other routes. Locomotives came and went, dispatchers shifted magnetic strips on the board, switches changed positions, and checked runners. A calendar hung on the wall in the staff room, with duty and departure times marked in small ink. The names of the engineers who had disappeared that night were now listed in the archived records. Their photographs were kept in a separate folder labeled "Official." On the back, in thin letters, were dates, seals, and positions. The paper was yellowing but unchanged. The case's silence was filled with activity. The investigators initially assigned to it moved to other departments. One changed stations, another retired, and a third signed annual reports as a supervisor. In their offices, the disappearance remained a line in a register, requiring no further verification. Everything was done, everything was filed, everything was closed. The case learned to live its own time, a time in which each new signature added only a date, not the content. Station memory was more stubborn. On the duty officer's desk lay a journal pad with a clear plastic corner where the current page was inserted. The line for the missing train was in the old issue, but the duty officers would occasionally glance back at it, as if it were a noticeable, tiny void. Not to correct it, but to confirm. The void remained a void. Any railway lives with such voids. One of them will always be found in the old journals, like a cardiac arrest, noticed and recorded. Families hired private individuals to follow trails, call acquaintances, and peer into corners where official eyes hadn't gone. They brought words and maps. A ravine, a ditch, an abandoned branch, a rusty guardhouse. The words vanished into thin air because the inspections always returned the same answers: not found. They arrived at the house, where the black frames around the photographs were in no hurry to remove them, and left sheets of paper that resembled reports but were unstamped. The sheets were stacked, the stacks were put into boxes, the boxes into cabinets. The papers grew shadowy. The railway's surface changed with the seasons and the years. In the spring, water drained into the ditches, dust settled in the summer, leaves fell and settled on the rails in the fall, and a snow line accentuated the geometry of the embankment in the winter. Trackmen signed the ends of routes. Their fingers were sometimes oily, leaving a barely noticeable dark mark on the paper. Blue drawings lay on the engineers' desks in their offices, and folders with sticky notes clung to them in cabinets. None of these things moved the needle, but together they maintained the order into which the disappearance had already been integrated. At the city archives, a young employee compiled a card index of unsolved railway incidents. The 1993 train was listed as "no confirmed accident." The details column contained standard words. The employee liked order and disliked legends. He cross-checked dates in newspapers and station logs, compiled them into tables, and drew lines on sheets of paper. In his files, the file took up little space, like a small dot in the margin, but he always remembered where that dot was. Widows and parents appealed to various authorities. Letters were sent to departments from which the responses returned, all identical like templates. "We express our sympathy. All possible measures have been taken. The case is closed in accordance with established procedure." The paper maintained a consistent tone. It did not allow words to overstep their bounds. When the last reply sank to the bottom of the envelope at the post office, several identical sheets of paper already lay there, like layers of identical voices. On the line, time was measured in trips, at the station in shifts, and at home in days without calls. This time provided no new information. It hardened old words. The common phrase, "died in the line of duty," became part of speech, like names on memorial plaques. Metal plaques with names and years were screwed to the plaque near the depot. Flowers were placed beneath them on holidays. Metal is cold and clear, leaving no room for ellipses. Thus, disappearance took shape in metal. Official archives occasionally reviewed the files, but more often they leafed through them, making sure dust hadn't eaten away the edges and the signatures were legible. New numbers, inventory numbers, appeared on the folder's cover to make searching easier. Over the years, the folder found its place on the shelf. It acquired neighbors, a case about a broken line on a bridge, a case about the theft of iron, a case about an incomplete shipment. Compared to these neighbors, the missing train seemed like an abstraction. It lacked the tangible trace that paper requires. Paper loves things. Photographs, pieces of metal, tags. In this case, there were only words and a cumulative silence. Sometimes, someone would recall that nighttime background noise in radio communications. The senior dispatcher, moving to a new station, would tell the younger crew there was a strange hum, as if the line was talking to itself. The younger crew would shrug. Radio often picks up reflections. Hardware can play tricks like that. But this story always included the note, "The last radio contact was normal." This turned the oddity into a memory without consequences. Warehouses in the warehouse district, where the darkness was denser, changed their lighting and rebuilt their corridors. Workers on night shift said that in winter, the wind blew stronger there than from the fields, as if the metal walls had their own breath. These conversations were enjoyed by those who smoked by the door during breaks, pressing the flame with their palms. But none of these stories touched on the composition. If they did, it was only indirectly. The background noise, the coolness, the silence, without any conclusions. The engineers' children were growing up. Their own documents appeared on their desks, passports, student ID cards, first contracts. In the folders that held the year 1993, new papers appeared. A certificate of marital status, a request for a review, a receipt for a letter sent. The folders grew heavier, but they didn't change the silence inside. One of the daughters brought a photograph to the archive. Two men in a cab, smiling, a thermos on the dashboard, and a folded raincoat nearby. The archive accepted the photograph and assigned it a number. Thus, a visible object appeared in the file. The seasons repeated themselves. Warm springs brought the scent of damp earth, dry summers dust, and cold winters the creaking of snow. Sometimes the yellow light at the passing traffic light would freeze until the mechanic came and returned everything to its usual order. Mechanics loved order. They said that the railway was a highly trained organism, where chance occurrences were rarely truly random. But if chance is recorded as a fact, it becomes part of the order. The missing train became such a fact. Order left a place for it, like leaving an empty locker for a key that no longer exists. The city wasn't without its memories. At the local transport museum, railroad legends hung on a display, old stories and unproven incidents. Among them, a small card appeared, the train that never reached the station. Beneath the card was a short line with the date. The guides remarked that the railroad sometimes remains silent. This was fair. Silence is also a form of preservation. Visitors nodded and moved on to the large locomotives where they could touch the cold surfaces and read the numbers on the plaques. The small card remained on its wall, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The period of silence proved longer than expected. In the first weeks after the disappearance, it taught those involved, families, workers, archivists, to speak briefly. Brevity protects against burnout. In business correspondence, it leaves room for work. In family conversation, it leaves room for silence. The world around them moved on. New lines were built, old ones closed, traffic lights were updated, cabin windows were replaced. The clock in one of the rooms at the station was replaced, and the white dial became brighter. Everyone noticed, but no one connected it to the case. Cases don't respond to clocks. They live in their own eras. 10 years after the disappearance, the date no longer stood out on the calendar. It remained in the family's memories, but not on the station's schedules. While on duty that day, the dispatcher placed a mug on the table and noticed the plastic spoon had left a thin circle on the paper. He pushed the mug away, traced the circle with his finger, and erased the mark. These gestures are repeated. They mean nothing, but they convey an attitude, keeping the paper clean. In matters of silence, this is especially important. The paper must remain clear if there is no answer inside. Thus, the time of silence continued to flow, its content unchanged. The vanished train remained a word without a body, though around it were many bodies, people, paperwork, iron, bridges, lamps. 3 elements held this story together: the absence of arrival, skid marks, scraps of cargo. They were neither added nor subtracted. If a railroad could keep a diary, it would contain a short entry, repeated year after year. Absence confirmed, work continues, and this entry became the most honest form of memory of a train that never reached the station. The spring of 2014 brought more than just warm air and the smell of damp earth. Construction work on a new line had begun on a section of the old line. Crews dug a tunnel, reinforced the vaults, and removed soil. There was nothing unusual about this work. The railway has always thrived on construction and repairs. But it was here, deep in the embankment, where silence had lain for decades, that something happened that changed things. The workers came across a wall that wasn't on the blueprints. At first, they thought it was an old fortification, filled with concrete during the Soviet era. But when they struck it with a crowbar, the concrete cracked, revealing a void. Inside, the air smelled of rust and dampness. When the flashlights illuminated the space, it became clear. This wasn't just a void, but a sealed tunnel. Inside stood the train cars, rusty, warped, but recognizable. The metal was coated in a brown film, the wheels sunk into the ground, but their outlines remained clear. The workers were silent. Before them lay something that had been considered unfound for decades. The first thing they did was call the engineers. They arrived with tape measures, flashlights, and cameras. They recorded everything: the length, width, and condition of the metal. The words discovered, identified, and partially preserved appeared in the reports. For the first time in 20 years, new entries appeared in the case file. When they opened the locomotive's cabin, they found it empty. The seats were torn by time. The instruments were covered in a film, but there were no people. A folded raincoat lay on the floor, the very one they always carried with them. The fabric had rotted, but its shape was recognizable. A thermos lay nearby, the lid unscrewed, revealing dried sediment inside. These items became proof. The cabin belonged to that very train. Then attention shifted to the train cars. Most were empty, their rotted floorboards crumbling underfoot. But one car stood out. Its doors were closed, the seals rusty but intact. When they were removed, a metal container was found inside. It stood in the center, as if it had been specially secured. There were no markings on the container's walls. No number, no stamp, no sign of the sender. The cargo manifest didn't list such a container. Documents preserved in the archive listed construction materials, containers, and inventory. There was no unmarked container. This fact immediately transformed the discovery from a technical matter into a criminal one. Investigators arrived quickly. They photographed, measured, took rust samples, and documented every detail. New words appeared in the reports: non-compliance, container, missing from documentation. These words shattered the previous theory. If the train derailed and burned, then where did the sealed tunnel come from? If the cargo was ordinary, then why wasn't one container listed in the manifest? The newspapers started talking about the case again. The headlines were short: train found, tunnel keeps a secret, container without a number. Whispers began in town again. Some said the container was carrying military supplies. Others said it was contraband. Still others claimed the train had been deliberately hidden. The engineers' families were the first to receive the news. For them, it wasn't a revelation, but rather confirmation. The train had existed. It hadn't vanished into thin air. But with it came a new question. Why was it sealed in? And who gave the order? Old documents were dug up in the archives. There was not a word about the tunnel, not a single line about the construction of the fortifications, not a single signature. This silence was louder than any words. The spring of 2014 marked a turning point. The case, which had lain dormant for 20 years, was reopened. It was no longer an accident. It had become an investigation. And in this investigation, the main witness was not a person, but an unnumbered container standing in a rusty train car, walled up in the wall of a tunnel. The container sat in the train car like a strange word on a page, where all the other words were clear. The metal was darker than the rust around it, dense, as if holding in the cold. There were no markings on the walls, no letters, no numbers, no shipper's stamps. The reinforcement ribs were neat, without chips. The door was held in place by 2 locks, their tongues frozen, as if untouched. The floor around it bore traces of old moisture, thin lines running toward the corners where the boards had rotted. The container was dry. They measured it. The records showed numbers: length, width, height, weight. The weight didn't match what one might expect from the empty body. The entry indicated a density rarely achieved by ordinary industrial boxes. When they tried to move it, the car responded with a dull creaking sound, and the metal seemed immobile, as if part of a support structure. Traces of old fasteners were found on the ribs, welded metal ridges at the corners of the floor. This wasn't a standard transport fastening. The container wasn't simply standing, it was being held. The seals were removed in the presence of those responsible for each line in the protocol. The cutter dug into the rust, and the metal peeled off in chunks like bark. The locks gave way more slowly than expected. When the door was slightly opened, the air that came out was almost odorless. Only dry dust, no oil, no damp, no chemicals. The door was opened carefully, avoiding any sudden movements. It was darker inside than outside, even with the streetlights on, like a box where the light is absorbed by the walls. The contents gave no clue as to what it was. In the foreground was a grey paneling, laid in even stripes along the walls. Below were bags, black and thick, with rolled edges and no markings. In the center was a metal frame, supporting a structure of blocks, rectangular shapes, connected by cables that lacked the usual factory markings. The cables were held together by cable ties. The ties were old but not crumbling. On one of the blocks was the mark of a removed plate, 4 empty screw holes. The plates themselves were missing. If there had been numbers, they had been removed. The reports read, "Found. Frame, blocks, cables, packages." Not a word was wasted. Photos were taken along the lines. Panorama, plan, details. The details showed that some connections didn't match those typically found on industrial equipment. There were no standard connectors, no color codes. The silence was intentional. The container was closed as soon as the initial inspection was completed. A new seal was placed on the door, this time with today's date. A temporary tracking number was written on the side with a marker. The notes were filed away, now containing new words. Manifest discrepancy, container unmarked, contents unknown. These words formed like tracks leading to another branch. The archive turned to the dispatch documents. The 1993 manifest listed fewer containers than were currently in the car. The seal register confirmed the numbers of known units, but no references to this particular car were found. The Special Conditions column listed items requiring careful handling, but none of them matched in size. The marshalling log contained notes on the formation of the train, involving a storekeeper and a receiver. Their signatures were uniform and familiar. Now these signatures became questions. People arrived who read metal the same way others read text. They knocked on the wall, listening for the sound, muffled, without resonance, like a dense shell. They removed the top panel, where the fastening ran along a wide seam. Under the panel, they found an insert, a thin layer, like a protective gasket. It was cold and dense to the touch. At the corner, there was a trace of old paint that didn't match the color of the body. This meant the container had been assembled from parts. This meant it wasn't a standard model. In the presence of the investigator, one of the packages was removed. It was heavy, with a smooth, bubble-free surface. They placed the package on the table and cut the edge. Inside were thin sheets of film, packaged like plastic wrap. The sheets were dark and smooth, with barely noticeable lines on the ends, like the edges of crystals. Their orderly arrangement prompted caution. Do not touch them with your hands. Do not disassemble them without disposal. There was no text on the package. The word material appeared in the report without further elaboration. The cables ran down the center of the unit, which lacked the familiar access holes. The units had smooth walls, with a row of small contacts on one side, like those found in closed systems. Fingers were not allowed. On the bottom of the frame, faint markings were found. 3 letters, faded almost to nothingness. They didn't match any known factory codes. On the back of one unit, there was a scratch resembling a number that had been diverged, but the number was illegible. The absence indicated a presence that someone had removed. They asked for documents from everyone who might know: the station manager at the time, the storekeeper, the receiver, the mechanic, the duty officers. The replies recalled the night, but not the container. The composition was standard. The seals were checked against the manifest. The light was green. The silence in the words echoed the silence in the metal. The case grew not from the details, but from their absence. The families were told that a container had been discovered that wasn't listed in the documents. It sounded dry, but it was the most honest thing. The relatives brought old notes, scraps of rumors from those years, mentioning a special cargo in one of the train cars. Back then, it seemed like common parlance. Now it's a drop in the bucket, not proof, but a reminder. Memory sometimes touches the edge of truth. In the case, that drop settled alongside the numbers. Reconciliations began at the departmental level. Folders were opened one after another. Internal regulations, diagrams, train formation plans, cargo routing. They shuffled pages, looked for matches, added bookmarks. The discrepancy grew like a line on a graph. In one document, they found a footnote, a pencil mark reading "add," unsigned and undated. Next to it, a blank space. If something had been added, it wasn't reflected in the manifest. A pencil mark isn't proof, but it's a trace. The container was reopened for a second inspection, this time in front of different people. Another panel was removed from the frame, revealing a thin wire stretched taut like an old-style alarm system. The wire was secured with small clips, and a path led from it to the control unit. The control unit didn't turn on. There was no power supply or target. But the wire itself revealed its intent. It wasn't the casing that was supposed to protect the contents, but the internal logic, not from accidental access, but from unauthorized access. We sent inquiries to places that might know such logic. The responses came slowly and said one thing: without markings, no one would take responsibility for accuracy. The material in the packages could have been any thin plates, from technical to specialized ones, blocks, from control ones to mock-ups. Without text, everything remains an object. The newspapers returned to the case and wrote about the nameless container. Comments were cautious. This is not a typical case. The investigation is ongoing. There is insufficient information. This was correct. In a history where paper rules, it is better to leave something unsaid than to add something that has no place in the record. For the families, this again meant holding on until the exact words were brought. A separate room was set up for storage. The container was moved. The train car was closed. The storage room contained racks with numbers repeating exactly. A sign on the door indicated the date, time, and person in charge. A new line appeared in the storage log, and this was the first line where the train's disappearance became the presence of an object. Objects always change their rhythm. They require care, accounting, and space. Silence learns to live alongside them. At the station where this story began, the duty officers knew that the case had acquired content. They didn't discuss it. Their job was to process and accept it. But in the rooms where the clocks hung, a new word had appeared, one that was now occasionally heard at meetings: evidence. It wasn't a loud word, but a precise one. Without this precision, the story doesn't move forward. They compared signatures. In one of the documents, they discovered an authenticity that didn't match the clean lines. The signature appeared to have been written by a different hand. The expert said cautiously, "There are grounds for verification." A verification isn't a conclusion, but for the case, it's a step forward. Where there had been a smooth road of identical wording, a bump appeared that caught the eye. The evidence didn't explain where the engineers were. It didn't say where the locomotive went that night, between two deserted stations. It didn't put the word "arrived" in the blank space in the logbook. But it had internally changed the route. Now the records contained something that didn't match the paper world of 1993. In criminal parlance, this is called a pretext. In documentary parlance, it's a basis. At the end of the week, a summary report was compiled. Discrepancy detected. Container with contents not accounted for in the manifest. Preliminary assessment, not classified as standard shipment. Requires verification, analysis, and origin determination. The report didn't attempt to be smarter than the facts. It merely documented the course of events. The silence didn't disappear. The files still lay in the archive. The small cards still hung in the museum in the city, and the couplings still clanked, and the switches clicked at the station. But from the moment the container door was first opened and the dry air entered, the disappearance ceased to be completely empty. It acquired an object. An object is a point from which a thread can be pulled. The thread can break, or it can go somewhere where numbers, signatures, and metal finally give the same word. For now, it's gone. There is only evidence, standing in a rusty train car, illuminated by lanterns, and a protocol with neat signs, where each sign means that silence must give way to another line. Once the container was in storage and the first protocols were filed, the case was no longer merely technical. It had entered the realm where documents begin to contradict each other and signatures no longer match. Old train logs were retrieved from the archives. Some sheets bore the neat signatures of the storekeeper and receiver, while others bore the same names. But the lines of the letters were different, as if the handwriting had been hasty or belonged to a different person altogether. The experts carefully wrote, "There are signs of discrepancy." The word wasn't a catchy one, but in paper language it meant a crack. Departmental checks revealed something else. On the night of the departure, an order for priority transportation had been issued along the line. The order was brief, lacking detail, but it bore a classification usually reserved for military cargo. The manifest for the train didn't list such cargo. The order didn't include a train number, only the time and section, but the time matched. A bookmark appeared in the file with a penciled note, "Check with order." The drivers' families received notice that the investigation had been reopened. The letter stated, "New circumstances have been discovered." These words were dry, but behind them lay hope that the disappearance would no longer be a void. However, along with hope came fear. If the order was genuine, then the drivers were carrying cargo they didn't know about. And if the cargo was hidden, then someone had a vested interest in preventing the train from reaching the station. The newspapers wrote cautiously. Some spoke of possible interference, others of inconsistent documents. Whispers began to swirl around the city again. On the benches outside the shops, people discussed whether the train could have been stopped deliberately. Some spoke of the military, others of industrialists, others of government officials. Rumors multiplied, but none became fact. The investigators requested access to higher-level archives. The answer came a month later. Access restricted. A new folder appeared inside the case file, marked "No Copying." It contained orders with lines crossed out with black lines. These lines spoke louder than words. If they were closed, it meant they contained something that shouldn't have been seen. At the station where it all began, the duty officers continued their work. But now the word "order" began to appear in their conversations. It sounded quiet, as if it shouldn't be spoken aloud. In the staff room where the photographs hung, someone said, if that was an order, then they had no choice. Those words went unanswered. The train that never reached the station card at the Transport Museum has been updated. Now, under the date, there's a line that reads, "New circumstances discovered." Tour guides cautiously said, "The story continues." Visitors listened and moved on, but the card was no longer just a legend. It became part of an investigation. Some documents began disappearing from the offices where the files were kept. One of the employees noticed that the seal inspection report was missing from the file. It was listed in the log, but the page was missing. A blank tab remained in its place. The report read, "Document loss." This word sounded like a death sentence. If a document is lost, it cannot be produced. The shadow of power fell upon the case, not as a loud scandal, but as a steady silence. In this silence, sheets of paper disappeared, new signatures appeared, lines were closed. It was as thick as the concrete of the tunnel where the train cars were found. And just like the concrete, it concealed what should have remained within. For the drivers' families, this meant a new anticipation. They knew the truth existed, but it lay behind black stripes and empty bookmarks. For the city, this meant a new legend. Now they talked not only about the train, but also about the order that accompanied it. For the railway, this meant a pause that would never be closed. At the end of the year, a summary report was compiled. The case requires further investigation. Signs of interference have been detected. The source of the order cannot be determined. These were the last words in the document, but they were not the last in history. Because now the disappearance was no longer just a tragedy. It became the question of who could have stopped the train and why. And that question was heavier than any container. Once the case was back in the hands of investigators, the city began to live with it differently. The disappearance was no longer just a line in an archive or a legend for a museum card. It became part of everyday memory, manifested in small details. Conversations at markets, articles in local newspapers, the way people looked at the rusty tracks leading toward the old tunnel. The drivers' families lived with a never-ending anticipation. In their homes, photographs weren't put away in drawers. Framed portraits hung on the walls alongside documents, letters, and certificates. Paper and faces coexisted, like two layers of a single story. Folders with departmental responses lay on their desks. Case closed. Circumstances are being clarified. Investigation ongoing. These words were repeated for decades, and each new document didn't cancel the previous one, but only added another layer of anticipation. In the city, the memory of the train became part of speech. People would say, "like that train," when they wanted to describe something that had vanished without a trace. In school essays, children wrote about the train that never arrived as a symbol of mystery. At the Transport Museum, guides increasingly lingered over the card with the date 1993. Now they spoke not only of the legend, but also of the discovered tunnel, the unnumbered container, and the order no one recognized. The audience nodded, their eyes filled with more questions than answers. At the station, the attendants continued to open their logbooks. In older editions, the empty space remained in place. No one filled it. No one wrote the word "arrived." This emptiness became part of the ritual. Every new attendant knew it was there and that it was not to be touched. It was a reminder that the railway preserves not only movement, but also stops that are never explained. Newspapers were published cautiously, but regularly. Each new mention was accompanied by a photograph of a rusty tunnel or an archival photo of the train drivers. The captions were short. "The case is ongoing. The evidence is being kept. No answers." These captions became part of the city's visual memory. People saw them on the pages and knew the story was not closed. For the railway, disappearance became an internal symbol. In training classes for new employees, the 1993 train was sometimes mentioned as an example of how even the most precise system can retain a void. Instructors said, "A log isn't just numbers, it's also silence." Young drivers listened and understood that this wasn't about technology, but about memory. Families continued to bring flowers to the memorial plaque near the depot. The metal plaques with names glinted coldly in the sun. Beneath them lay fresh bouquets and sometimes notes. The notes contained no questions, only words. "We remember, we wait, we believe." These words were shorter than any protocol, but they carried more meaning. In the archives, the file continued to live its own life. Folders were rearranged, numbered, and moved from shelf to shelf. New stamps and dates appeared on the covers. Each new mark was proof that the story had not been forgotten. The archivists knew, as long as the folder sat on the shelf, it existed, and as long as it existed, the train had not completely disappeared. The memory of the train became part of the city, just like bridges, warehouses, and traffic lights. It didn't require grand words, didn't need explanation. It lived in the empty space of a magazine, in a museum card, in the flowers by the bulletin board, in short newspaper articles. It lived in a silence that was louder than any version. And this silence said one thing. The train never reached the station, but it remained in memory. And memory is also a road. It has no end, but it has a direction, and this direction always leads to a question that remains open.